All right, it's Friday. Just sitting here. I'm Joe Murray. We are on, I believe, quarantine week 9. This will be, I believe, the 30th episode of Just Sitting Here. We got a big one today. I know we finally have something to bet on, which is the itch I've had over the last couple of weeks with pretty much competitive eating contests or playing horse. I'm sick of betting on that, and a ton of UFC fights have happened this week, and we'll bring in Jon Anik in just a minute here. Just one thing I wanted to bring up quickly. You can listen to all our episodes on Spotify, YouTube, and on iTunes. You can listen to all the past interviews, including today's, which will be posted just after the show. And, of course, if you'd like to join the program today, you can use the chat feature, and I will pull your comments right on to the show. So, without further ado, I'll bring in today's guest. His name is Jon Anik. He is the voice of UFC. Is that all right to say, Anik? You're the voice of UFC?
Hey, I mean, I'm just sitting here. I'm just sitting here, man. It's your call, you know. You can call me whatever you want, but no one I'd rather be chopping it up with right now. You're my best student. I mean, the best student I ever had, right? Like, if I could have bet on Joey Murr at the time, I would have plopped my bet down on you. So it's great to see you.
I appreciate that, man. And we do go way back. So long story short, we'll get into your story too, but I was going to broadcasting school. I was a punk kid from Hyde Park in the city of Boston, and a wicked bad Boston accent at the time. I was like a real punk, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to go to broadcasting school. I know my shit, let's do this. But I didn't know you were like going to be my teacher. Like we were just shooting the shit about boxing outside one day. And you're like, yeah, I'm teaching the next class, and like we did a sports update, and just a couple of things. You put a note on the board. You're like, hey, if somebody wants an internship, contact this guy. I did, and boom, and I was there as an intern. I got hired from there, and kind of just kept on going. But if there's two things you taught me, one, you came from a AM station that had a large signal compared to where you heard it. But you've gone on to a great career, and look where you are now. But the second thing you taught me was, if there's Magic Johnson and Larry Bird are playing basketball at the park, the two best players in the world could be playing basketball at the park. But if a fight breaks out down the street, what's everyone going to watch? And everyone's going to go watch that fight, right? And that still to this day, Jon, I still keep that with me because, yes, the two greatest could be going at it. But if there's a fight going on, everybody's watching that fight.
Of course, right? I mean, we all have it in our blood, and it sounds a little trite, right? And Dana White says it a lot. Everybody likes fighting, or everybody is drawn to fighting, or they can't take their eyes away from fighting. But I just have to say, since I'm on your show, that if you have a regionalism or an accent, right, sometimes it can affect your ability to work in certain cities. It pains me a little bit to hear that yours has been tempered to such an extent because you had such a great twang at the time. But obviously, I believed in you and your ability, and nobody crushed my class or that sports update like you. And I've told stories over the years about you, and I want to hear you fucking rip that Boston accent. So for me, this is a little bit tough to hear the polish a few years later. But obviously, I've stayed in fighting, and I sort of got the bug late as a non-lifelong martial artist. But I'm glad that this is kind of where my life has taken me.
Awesome, man. And I always remember that story because, when it comes to sports now, like, dude, when I first got into radio, we all played sports, right? We all like think we know, the second level in football and all that. Nobody cares about that shit. They care about what's the interesting topics, what's the stuff that, what's the shit that people are gossiping about or want to know about. And it might not be great things. It might not be, anything that's like top headlines, but you got to talk about the shit that people care about and not so much the stuff that's truly important. And that took me a while to develop here, man. And I got to say, the one thing that you do as like an announcer, there's a lot of casual UFC fans, right? People are starting to come over to UFC, but you really break it down, like the New England cartel that's coming out or whatever, like this connection that's happening here throughout New England. Like you'll mention these guys' stories, where they've been, anything that's happened like off the mat or the octagon. Like UFC is one of the only sports where these dudes come from bad backgrounds or they do some bad shit. But when it comes to the ring or the octagon, man, like that's where they can take it out and be at their best. And like I feel like that's the story that you bring to the table just for either an average listener or just someone who continuously watches, I think you bring that aspect to the fight.
Well, I appreciate it. Certainly, as a play-by-play guy, you are trying to humanize these athletes as best as possible and shine as positive a light as possible on them without ignoring maybe things that weren't so positive in the past. But I mean, how much time do you have to tell some of these stories, right? I mean, certain siblings don't make it to the US, right? And now you have fighters shipping cars full of goods to their siblings who are older than them and stuck in Nigeria trying to get to the United States. I mean, there's one story after the next. The biggest issue I have is that sometimes when we do the walkouts, our domestic US viewers are in commercial break, right? So sometimes there are things I will say on the walk that I'll try to repeat during a fight. But our fight happens so quickly and things pivot on a dime that sometimes you just can't finish the story or go back to it because either a guy is twitching on the canvas or the action necessitates that you only talk about that. So it's not like we get 40 seconds between plays or a play clock or anything like that. And oftentimes between rounds or walkouts are commercialized. So I guess for me, pay-per-views are great. And I didn't call those until about 3.5, 4 years ago and really cut my teeth with the bottom half of this roster. On pay-per-view, there's no commercials. The walks are televised, and that's the greatest viewing experience that we can provide.
All right, so there's no fans in the stands. There's a couple of things that I noticed during the broadcast this week, and it might have been Wednesday's fight night. I think it was DC who mentioned that you can really hear for instance, who was it? Smith that went down, and you could hear if the crowd got behind it, that thing might have ended early. And I want to get into that in just a second here, but you've had a crazy week, right? I mean, UFC finally is, the first sporting, first sport basically that is going at it. Dana White's taking a lot of heat, but I applaud him for what's happening. He's like the baddest man on the planet right now, Dana White, right? I mean, let's face it. But talk about your journey, man. Like, you got to go to Jacksonville. You're calling 2 events in less than 4 days. Some of these are the biggest cards going. There's a lot of shit happening. Someone gets tested for COVID in his corner. Right. But the show must go on, man, and you're a part of that. Like, can you explain what your week's been like?
So I'll try to do it as efficiently as possible. I was conditioning myself to go to Lemoore, California for April 18th, right? And I live in South Florida, so I was going to go Fort Lauderdale to Denver, Denver to Fresno, and then a 40-mile drive to Lemoore in a climate that on April 18th seemed a lot less safe than maybe May 9th. But eventually I was going to have to rip off the Band-Aid, and given how bullish Dana was and how much of a run through a wall for that guy type of guy he is, I was ready to go. So I live in South Florida. Jacksonville just got dropped in my lap. So I got to drive to the show. So let's just start with the fact that I didn't have to fly across the country like the rest of the staff. So, but yeah, when you get there and you're not allowed to check into the hotel until you take a nasal swab and an antibody test, I think there's some anxiety. You didn't necessarily know what you were walking into. You just know that the UFC is a well-oiled machine. You know that we do 40-plus shows a year all over the globe with all sorts of different safety and security protocols. Some countries are safer than others. We have live production changes that happen all the time. So I have to tell you, and I hope it doesn't sound like it's just me saying this because they cut my check. We are very much conditioned to a lot of inconvenient truths and late live production changes that really fuck with my workflow. Even this card, we lost a fight. And at 1:00 in the morning, I had to change up all my scripts. 2 prelims moved to the main card, and I went to bed at 3:45 a.m. instead of 1:15 the night before the show. So got the COVID-19 test. Not super comfortable, but at least I don't have to go fight a man in a cage after doing that. So I tried to toughen it out. And then a crazy live broadcasting experience, masks and gloves on basically the whole time. You're not going out to dinner. You're just socially distancing and trying to do the best you can. We got 75 fight camps coming in and out for 3 shows in 8 days. The whole thing was fucking nuts, but remarkably, at least right now, as I sit here waiting for my final nasal swab or my next one to come back, we've only had 1 athlete test positive. So glad to have 2 shows in the can, but the weirdest, craziest week of my professional life for sure.
All right, just a couple of things to add on that. Someone tests positive. What are you thinking? What are you feeling yourself? Are you like, oh shit, is this going to go on? Could this affect me? Did you think they were going to shut it down? And I guess when this comes to other professional sports, if this happens to one person, should they handle it the way UFC did? Because so far it looks like everything was handled well, but this could be the blueprint, right? this could be the, hey, one person tested positive, get them out of here. We'll test everybody else, and the show must go on. Do you think this is the blueprint? And were you scared when you found out, that Souza came positive?
So circumstantially for me, I'm just leveling with you. Some of us got a second sample that was expedited, and I was in that batch with Jacare Souza, the athlete who tested positive and who was asymptomatic. So I got my results like 5 minutes before word came down that he had tested positive. So I was excited to get a negative result, and then I got the news that he was positive. And when I got the news that he was positive, there was an intimation that he was the only one of the athletes who had tested positive. So show must go on, live production. Obviously, we made some changes at that point in time. And I don't know, I was just so focused on the production elements that I wasn't fearful that the show was in jeopardy. I knew he was asymptomatic. So I felt pretty confident that as long as we weren't losing 2 or 3 athletes or fights, that the show was going to go on. And then, of course, we did the next one and everybody was clean. So, yeah, there wasn't much anxiety. And I don't know, man, it's crazy being quarantined for 60 days. And then you go to a hotel with a bunch of athletes. Like, that becomes your new normal. And not that I stopped wearing my mask, but the anxiety did fade.
Yeah. And not to mention, you're a family man, right? You can't see you can't see your family. Like, there's a lot of shit. I wanted to get in your head on that because I don't know. It seemed like everybody was like, the fights are on. Let's get these fights going. Even the fighters themselves, like UFC 249 was a really good card. Yeah. I thought it was great. So I bet on all these fights, John. Like, like that's my angle on it. Is like, all right, can we actually bet on this shit? Yeah. But I was impressed with all the fights in general. But I just want to bring something up about Dana White. His comments this week, like, he's like, all right, yep, I got the blueprint, yep, I know how to do this, and I applaud the UFC for going forward. And again, I think the UFC is the catalyst for other sports leagues. I know he has his own thoughts on Bob Arum, which we can get to later on here, but how do you feel like working for a guy like Dana White? And this gets into your story. How did you connect with Dana White years ago? Because I know you were doing the the UFC shit with ESPN, you and Kenny Florian, and you guys are still doing your podcast now. But how do you feel working for that guy, and how did you guys get connected?
All right, so quickly in terms of him and the whole COVID-19 backdrop and the execution of that, when I lay out what we do on a week-to-week basis over 40 weeks, a lot of people don't want to hear that and think I just don't have respect for the virus or the respiratory therapists and what message they're trying to give me for trying to put on a live event. It's not that I don't have respect for the virus, right? That's really not the case. I just believe that Dana has this promotion condition to do a show like that. So certainly he's a guy that you want to work for and run through a brick wall for. I was working at ESPN. I sort of became their de facto MMA guy. I was hosting a show called MMA Live from 2008 to 2011. And at that time in 2011, the UFC was essentially doubling its schedule, doubling the number of live events. And I was being offered half of those events. I got offered it in a verbal setting when I was covering a UFC pay-per-view in New Jersey. Actually, it was March 2011, the night John Jones became the youngest champion in UFC history. Craig Borsari, my boss, pulled me aside and said, hey, we got a job for you. It's rooted in play-by-play. We're going to essentially be doubling our shows and have your agent call me on Monday. I don't even know if I had an agent, but I had somebody call him on Monday. And, the rest, as they say, is history. For me, I wasn't getting the play-by-play opportunities that I wanted at ESPN. I'd get a college football game here or there. But when you get a taste of doing a live event, at least for me, being a highlight machine, sitting on a studio in Bristol, Connecticut was no longer anything close to what I wanted to do for a living. So I wanted to do play-by-play. They were giving me that opportunity. And even though I maybe wasn't the most qualified guy from a mixed martial arts standpoint, I felt like I had a lot to offer in the play-by-play space. I knew how to stay in my lane and play to my strengths. And, that's kind of how I took it in 2011. And you treat each show with a lot of respect. And it's been a fast decade. It's been a busy decade. I was never somebody who wanted to leave this US of A, my man. I always say when this gig is over, with respect to the rest of the world, I'm going to shred my passport and never leave. So that's been something I've had to condition myself to. I've been to Brazil 27 times, but it's what we signed up for. And it's a hell of a ride, at least as it's going on.
And you're doing a hell of a job, man. So what we do on this podcast is we'll get into all the good stuff because there's a ton of UFC stuff to cover, a shitload of UFC stuff to cover. But, dude, you're somewhat of a legend in this town, and people can chat in. Obviously there's some chats coming in, going back to the CSP days, of course. People love Jon Anik, man. They love you as a guest. Boston through and through.
Right?
There you go, man. But tell us your story, dude. Like, I know that you were at 1510. There was a story recently here on the Boston Globe. Chad Finn, reached out to a lot of people who were at 15. I was at the tail end, man. Once it got to Marina Bay and left Burlington,
yeah,
things were different, man. Once you lose the rights to a franchise, it's the money doesn't come in and it's hard. But I guess tell your story. How you got into radio, the 1510 angle, and then eventually how you got on ESPN.
Well, thankfully, Chad Finn's memory is better than mine, because that dude was jogging my memory and asking me for things if I still had them. And I didn't even remember that shit had been going on. So for me, I interned for Anthony Pepe at WEEI. Pepe and the Water Boys back in 2000, the summer of 2000, while I was in between years at Gettysburg College. And we hit it off, obviously. And, Nomar was my guy, and K cards and everything else. I would do anything for Pep. I mean, without Anthony Pepe, none of this shit ever happens. UFC, none of it. So bless that guy. Can't praise him enough. But basically, when I reconnected with Pep later on, he couldn't give me an internship at 1510 The Zone unless I was getting course credit. So I tried to go to 1510 without going to the Connecticut School of Broadcasting as a student, because I had just, gotten a 4-year degree and I didn't have $12 to give to CSB. So I took out a loan. I went to the Connecticut School of Broadcasting for the sole purpose of getting the internship, and was able to break down some walls at 1510, came up under Ryan Russillo. So I learned, he worked probably harder than you had to in some respects, and still does. But I learned what you needed to do under that guy. And that really helped me understand what was required in order to go on the radio on a day-to-day basis. Opportunities, man. It's just about being fortunate, being in the right place at the right time, having Pepe believe in me to put me on the diehards. And Russillo deserved to have the trepidation, but he eventually respected me and came to value me on the show. And he put me out there to ESPN Radio in Bristol, Connecticut, as Dave Jagler did. I mean, I had to send my tape like everybody else, right? Like, that door wasn't necessarily broken down for me. But I couldn't get a bite in Montana, and yet I got an audition at the ESPN Radio Network in Bristol, Connecticut. And the advice I probably gave you, Joey Murr, was you got to be ready when you get that opportunity. I didn't know when I went down to audition for ESPN Radio that one of my updates would actually be live that day on the air. You do one in the back, and then they have you go out and actually do the goddamn 420 on national radio. I couldn't believe it. They're like, do an 80-second update and then press this button. I'm like, are we really doing this? And you're either ready or you're not. They can throw away one update. And I guess I was ready, and one opportunity led to another, transition from radio to TV, and here we are. But I don't know, man. You got to have people believe in you. I've had a few of those, and thankfully was able to parlay it into something, I guess.
So just going back, man. You've been out of the radio scene for a bit here in Boston. WEEI was the king, man. I work over at the 98.5 The Sports Hub now, and they went FM, and I think that's what changed things here. And plus the Bruins, like I think at times EEI didn't care about the Boston Bruins, and I'm not shitting. There isn't this the Sports Hub and EEI hate each other thing. It's right. Not real, and I know ratings is a thing, but for you were part of something that was essentially a competitor to like the diehards, man. Like, tell us about that crew, dude, because that was a damn good crew. And if you look at them, everyone's gone on to do very good things. So, say what you want about 1510. That was a stepping stone for you. And you just said how you got opportunities and people believed in you. But, like, that was a competitor, man. People still talk about the diehards till this day.
Well, hey, I appreciate that. And for me, once Russillo believed in me and we became friends, those were the funnest days of my professional life. I mean, my dream job was to host the morning show at WEEI. I don't know how qualified I am to do that right now. I haven't been able to do just as much Boston sports over the last half decade, but certainly I see a dream sequence where I could end up back in Boston hosting Morning Drive on a big stick. I mean, I would love to do it. But yeah, I guess for me, once Russillo believed in me, it was just so fun to walk into that studio every day because those guys were fucking hilarious. We felt like the content was good. We had Todd McShay and Buster Olney, and they were on the come up. And we just felt like, from a content standpoint, as humbly as I can say this, we were really providing something that was so different than what was down the dial, which at that point to me, I think had just become noise. And I say that respectfully. I love callers, right? But they can't be the lifeblood of your show. We didn't have a call bank to lean on, right? Yeah. So that forces you to be pretty good. There was no social media back then. So if people didn't like my take, or they thought I was smoking weed in the garage during the 7th inning and not watching the game, they better call the show, because if they didn't do that, there was no way to reach me. There was no Twitter page or anything like that. Yeah. So it was a totally different climate. But really just so fun to go to work. And I was doing my dream job, even if there were not as many people listening as we wanted to be listening.
Quickly, I know on ESPN you did the UFC was it UFC Fight Night with Kenny Florian? Because we knew Florian as a local fighter here, and you guys kind of hit it off. So like here with me, right? Everyone can talk sports. And I was like, dude, we don't have a gambling guy here. Like, nobody talks gambling, nobody watches. So I thought that was kind of like my niche to, all right, let's get on the radio. Like, you did UFC, man. Like, that was a niche sport at the time. Let's face it. Like, people knew who Chuck Liddell was or Tank Abbott or these guys. But, like, did you think that could have been your way to get in?
I didn't look at it that way. It was just that when I went and watched the sport live in person for the first time in 2007 in Tunica, Mississippi, I was hooked. You know, I went in with a pessimistic boxing mentality, right? I loved boxing. I loved its pureness. I thought when boxing was at its best, it was the best sport in the world. And I thought mixed martial arts was just two guys wrestling, and I could just look at my phone, you know? So I went in and there were dragons breathing fire, and I didn't like that, but the action was unbelievable. And it had so much more than boxing. Mixed martial arts has ruined boxing for me. So I didn't see it that way. I think if anything, for my niche, gambling would have been a much more natural fit, right? And probably was my foremost passion, other than Nomar, I think, at the time, you know? So for me, it was really just about loving this sport, not believing that it could get me anywhere. But when there were opportunities in mixed martial arts, I certainly took them. But watched my first MMA show with the Mouthpiece Boxing Show. Pep and I went to cover an Elite XC event in Tunica, Mississippi. And then you fast forward a year later, MMA Live with me and Ken Flo launches on ESPN.com, April 2008. And it was all about mixed martial arts, really, for me from that point on. I was ordering every UFC pay-per-view. And the goal at that point becoming the play-by-play lead voice of the UFC.
Dude, and I'll tell you, it's funny, your trajectory in your career. Radio is, been consistent, but it's hard. Boxing, where's that sport gone? I want to ask you that in a little bit. And then where UFC has gone, it's gone up. So you've gone with the trend, man. Like, that's the one thing, 13 years away from town, like, you're trending upwards, man. You're up and to the right. The stock in Jon Anik is definitely hot. All right, so we'll get past all that shit because we all know you're a hometown boy and you represent. But I got to ask you about this picture, my man, okay? This one right here, dude. This thing was like the hottest thing going, man. You, DC, Rogan, like, dude, what happened? How did you get that type of reaction?
All right, so, well, I guess in terms of the reaction, it was because Beneil Dariush looked like he was going to get knocked out by Drakkar Klose, and then and then Beneil comes back and knocks out Drakkar. So that's what causes that type of reaction in this specific instance. The ebb and flow of the fight, you think fighter A is going to win, and then fighter B comes back and knocks him out, right? This happens all the time. I just think this was the perfect scenario. All of our reactions were captured at the same time, and it resulted in that. You say I'm with the trends. I don't necessarily. I'm pretty ignorant when it comes to memes and things going viral. I got like 100 text messages with all these different captions over 2 weeks, and I didn't quite understand what that meant, but people intimated that this thing was really getting passed around and repurposed. And an artist did a rendition that I'm actually now having framed up to replace this thing, but it will be behind me soon. And an incredible moment, but it really was the result in one fighter coming back. We've had a lot of crazy moments. They didn't used to trot out those cameras, or at least those camera feeds on the broadcast, right? I mean, those have always been there, but they didn't like run our reactions on the broadcast, and that's giving people the opportunity to take it and run with it. But us play-by-play guys, we're supposed to avoid the spotlight, man. Yeah. So it's so weird for me.
And again, all right. So when I watched the XFL this year, one thing I really liked, Steve Levy would always tell the betting line, man. Like, and he's not an experienced play-by-play guy, but put him in there, he does a nice job. You're like, oh, we got the heavy favorite here, and like it's part of it, and I think that's great. And again, I know I'm a gambling guy, but like, I think it's good to know who the underdog is. And again, the no crowds, and we had somebody checking in. just asking about that. People think you're a Hall of Fame, but somebody was just asking, what do you think about the feelings on no crowds with guys going for knockouts? And then on Wednesday there was a lot of, but on UFC 249 the overs hit like crazy. So on Wednesday, I don't know if the crowds, maybe things adjusted, but what were your thoughts on that?
So we're probably burying the lead, and I'm glad that Joey Murr, you're getting to this, and one of your viewers is, because it effectively changes the sport, right? They can hear the announcers crystal, and they can hear their corners. They can hear the opposite corners. Maybe they can't hear what's being told to them between rounds, but then when we relay that information to an audience, it stands to reason that they're hearing that. So I did make a little bit of a pivot on Wednesday after going through the experience on Saturday, and was only more measured in between rounds when I'm saying, all right, Trevor Whitman just told his fighter to do X, Y, and Z. How do you think the other corner will adjust? And then Daniel Cormier gives the adjustment, and both guys hear it. It's fucking crazy. There's not a whole lot we can do about it. I don't want a plastic shield in front of me attached to my headset.
Yep.
I do believe there are going to be different broadcasting environments. When we go to Vegas, we might be in a control room and not on the floor, and so then it won't become an issue. But it certainly changes things. And once we started word trickling down to us that the fighters might have been using Daniel Cormier's analysis to actually help them in the fight, I took my cans off to listen. Dude, you could hear his voice echoing on every wall in the arena. And I think for a fighter too, when you get cracked with an uppercut, you're in your moment, you hear the crowd, but you're still trying to hear your corner. Now you hear some obnoxious play-by-play guy go, oh, St. Preux just got absolutely cracked in his chin. And it's like, all right, dude, shut the fuck up and let me fight, So at one point, dude, Wednesday night, I don't know if you caught it, but we were talking about Ricky Simone's physicality, and DC was like, this dude's a beast. And Ricky Simone just starts and I just, belly laughed. It's crazy, bro. It's crazy.
So I think DC's great. And dude, I'm a huge, I watch WWE. I'm a wrestling fan. And one thing that's changed is they don't have play-by-play guys that are getting inside the head of the wrestlers, where like DC is doing that, man. He was even like getting on Felder about how, there was one time we were watching a fight, man, and there was this little redheaded guy in there and we didn't know who he was. And like, it was like, dude, he's telling the story about the guy he's sitting next to, about what's going on in the ring. Like he's outstanding. But I got to ask you about Joe Rogan quickly, because DC's great at that. Like, all right, the guy's awesome. He's fucking great. But Joe Rogan is
DC's the most naturally gifted broadcaster that I've ever seen. First time I saw him, I was in the delivery room with my wife in 2011, watching MMA live on TV, people filling in for me. And that was the first time I ever watched him do TV, and he hit it out of the park. I was like, this guy could be Charles Barkley, except he's better and he's more technical. So absolutely. But yeah, Rogan's been my primary broadcast partner for half the shows that, all the shows he does, half the shows I do for 3 years. And, just embraced me to such an extent, man. He worked in a 2-man booth for 20 years, and then he got a new play-by-play guy and then another pro fighter to his right, and had to adjust to a 3-man booth. I wish he got more credit in terms of like the sports Emmys and the US audience, right? I know it can be an old man's club a little bit when it comes to that stuff, but how has Joe Rogan never been nominated for a sports Emmy? It's criminal to me. It always feels more special when he's there. People always ask about what we talk about when we're not talking about fighting and different shit. Like I don't have all these great Joe Rogan stories, but when we have a cup of coffee before the fights, we talk about the fights because that's the deepest level on which we can possibly connect. It's a foremost passion in both of our lives. We're professional fans. So, we talk about weed and coffee and random shit, but a lot of it circles back to fighting because that's what we love.
So, dude, he's in the ring after these fights the other night. No gloves on, no mask. He's in there. Like, that dude's straight up balls. And then, like, he's doing podcasts like, dude, I don't know, man. If California's going to shut shit down, man, I got to move to Texas. There's betting odds if he's going to move to Texas right now. But, like, I don't know. You say you guys talk about shit that's not so much. But, like, he's a dude, to me, like, he's a polarizing figure, dude. This dude's sitting next to you. And then you got one of the best fighters there, the best analysis guys. Like, dude, I wonder what it's like for you on the road, man. You got all these great people around you.
He's a true Renaissance man, and he's so generous and gracious. And we used to go out to dinner more than we do now because I now do the post show afterwards for ESPN Plus. So some of those opportunities have been limited. But he's a Renaissance man. I hope that this isn't repetitive to some of your audience that has heard me elsewhere. But Howard Stern and Joe Rogan. I can't find anybody else who has had more of an impact on the American male. And for Rogan, it's so global, right? He can't go to Australia. I mean, in part because he's got too much shit to do back home. But bro, like every single Australian watches our post-fight press conference. I don't do that, right? Every single Australian watches every post-fight press conference for 40 plus shows a year. It's the NFL over there, right? So rock stars. So yeah, I mean, he has different navigations as an A-list celebrity. If you need someone to get you into a restaurant at 2:15, 2:30 in the morning, half hour after close in Chicago, he's your guy. But he's just a real dude. You know, he's a huge MMA fan. And obviously that comes across on the broadcast. But I just think there are so many people who know more about him than I do because they've literally listened to every second of his every podcast for 10 years. And I listened to plenty of the Joe Rogan Experience, but everybody in my life has this deep knowledge of Joe Rogan. Everybody wants a piece of him. Many think I can be the conduit through which they get to Joe. And I'm very reluctant to pass along his information or even to reach out to him with that. You know, I'd say 1 out of every 50, I say, hey, man, this dude's trying to get a hold of you. Sorry to bother you, but special guy and happy that he's in my life for sure.
All right, man. 3 big events in the UFC this week was UFC 249. Of course, there was the fight night and ESPN tomorrow, UFC. I thought the star of the week was Justin Gaethje.
Yeah.
What's next for him? I bet him as a dog. I thought he'd win that fight, but he's rising, man. And I thought he was just the star of the week. What do you see in this kid and what's next for him?
So if you had said the star of the week was someone else, I don't know what I was going to say. So my fantasy football team is called Team Gaethje. He's the toughest dude in America. Put in all the right work in advance of the toughest fight of his career. For people who don't know his history, came into UFC 20 or 21-0, having successfully defended a major promotions title 5 times. Was ubiquitously regarded by the hardcore fans as an elite lightweight, but needed that signature win and that accompanying strength of schedule to prove his worth. Did that and then some, now has the UFC championship belt to prove it. Couldn't happen to a better guy. Can't talk about Gaethje, though, without mentioning one of my broadcast partners, Trevor Whitman, his head coach, as powerful a 1-2 punch as there is in the sport. But Gaethje set out with the goal in mind to be elite, but to be the most entertaining man in MMA, right? Because he thought that dovetailed with making a lot of money, and he certainly was not wrong on that. But he wanted to be the most entertaining man in MMA, fucking check the shit out of that box, and then move along to trying to become the best fighter in the world. It took 2 losses for him to realize that he needed to make some tweaks. Whether there was a crowd in the building or not, he was able to make those tweaks this weekend, and I think he might have Tony Ferguson's number 7 or 8 out of 10 times were they to fight, but wasn't a banner night for Tony, whom I love. I'm sad from that perspective, but very happy for Justin Gaethje and think, you know, it'll be a pretty competitive fight against Khabib if it happens in September or October.
What do you think of that? I mean, obviously Khabib's got some, you know, it was a nice tribute, you know, to his father and everything like that this week. But Khabib is obviously polarizing, right? Like we've seen what's happened before here, but do you think that happens? Like, what is it right now? What would hold that? So you think this is on its way? Yeah, I'm always wondering if there's a holdup with this guy.
Yeah, well, candidly, and you sort of referenced the tribute to Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov, whose condition is grave. But I think right now the biggest variable in that fight happening is his father's condition, at least because the UFC has proven that we can get shows off the ground. And if Fight Island gets infrastructure in June, that fight obviously can happen there. But as far as the competitive nature of it, and also too, Joey, they're both managed by the same guy. There's a lot of motivation to get that fight done. Ali Abdelaziz manages both guys. So that fight's going to happen. Khabib always wants to fight the most deserving guy. And now he's got an interim belt, so he can't get passed in line, even by someone like Conor McGregor. What's interesting for me, and Gaethje's a live dog in this equation too, but he isn't the biggest lightweight. Gaethje doesn't cut a lot of weight. And under the suffocating Khabib Nurmagomedov, I do think that could be a real issue. You know, Justin Gaethje, when he was an elite collegiate wrestler who exceeded expectations, he was known as a guy who had great takedown defense and was really hard to ground. So I think he can stay upright. I think he can hip escape and try to get up, but you don't know what it feels like to be underneath Khabib until you're underneath him. And if he feels like a heavyweight, as many attest, it's going to be hard to simulate that in training when he weighs 155 pounds. So I'm hopeful that Justin can be competitive in that setting, but Khabib's 28-0 for a reason, and more reasons than one.
All right, the next star I had this week was Francis Ngannou. I go back to the Ngannou-Stipe Miocic fight. It was boring, but Stipe had the greatest game plan, right? Just hold. Yeah. You cannot square up with that man. I'm sorry. You put him against the cage, and you hold him there, and you pray you get through. Yeah. But dude, I've been at the blackjack table, John, and I've lost money. I lost money on the Ngannou fight faster than I've lost at the blackjack table. Like that fight, dude. I don't know why I took the over 1.5. I know both guys have that, one round knockout. I thought it did at least dance for a little bit. Yeah, he's starting to impress now.
Well, if you listen to the Anik and Florian podcast, our handicapper, who is 11-1 now, his best bet was under 7.5 minutes. And I think you have to go under now, and it'll be prohibitively priced now. You got to go under on Ngannou fights heretofore. So the Stipe fight came at a time for Francis Ngannou that he wasn't ready for the fight. He wasn't ready for the media obligations. He was in a really bad place in our fighter meeting on Thursday. Had to cut a lot of weight, and it was the perfect storm for disaster, yet he didn't quit over 25 minutes. Chael Sonnen often says that a fighter's biggest fear is not getting knocked out or hurt. It's getting exhausted in there, right? And it makes sense, right? Cardio abandons you. There's no fucking worse feeling than when you're locked in another man with a cage, right? Because you got to quit or, worry that your heart's going to explode. So that happened to Francis Ngannou, but he didn't quit. So that was encouraging. Then he had a weird outlier fight against Derek Lewis, the Black Beast. Ever since, he's knocked out basically 4 of the best guys in the world in 111 or less. He is our Mike Tyson. He's the most terrifying force to have ever entered that octagon, supplanting Anthony Rumble Johnson in my mind. I think he would be a betting favorite against any heavyweight in the world right now. I don't believe Stipe could hold him down for 25 minutes in a rematch. I don't think Daniel Cormier could either. I think Francis Ngannou eventually will be the UFC heavyweight champion. And I think when the belt's around his waist, he'll really be Tyson and he'll really vault to superstardom. There's no reason why he can't be doing 2 million pay-per-views a year. I mean, a show. So I think he could be a huge star, but I think a lot of that is sort of inexorably linked to him having the belt, which entering his 13th UFC appearance, he doesn't have.
So it brings up the next question. I know the weight classes or whatever, but Jon Jones, right? Couldn't that be a thing? Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now it could be a thing. I mean, we are in an unforeseen climate, and if a fight of that magnitude can get made, I think there are a lot of parties that would move to make it. I think for Ngannou, it's a little bit tricky with this DC Stipe trilogy, which beckons because he has to wait right now. He has to wait for a championship opportunity, and if it's going to be 9 or 10 months, why not fight Jon Jones in a mega fight situation, almost like the BMF belt or something like that? I mean, you don't have to put a belt on the line, but this fight doesn't need a belt. I would like to see Jon Jones, if and when he does move up to heavyweight, if that's an eventuality, I'd like to see him do it the right way and do so with finality and be 240 pounds on the scale instead of 220 or 230. But I just feel like right now might be the time to strike with that fight. And if both parties are willing and they can get the numbers right, I think it's a huge pay-per-view. I don't say that out of any disrespect to the light heavyweight contenders or the belts in either division, but I'd be lying if I said that fight doesn't get me excited.
That's right. Hey, listen, it's about the marquee names, man, right? People want to watch it. Getting the average fans in on this, I think that would be a box office, like literally would light up the. And hey, UFC 249 was the most bet event of all time. I bet you'd get a ton of action in on that one. Just want to ask you, the New England connection. A lot of people here in the area this week, man. Is it Calvin Kattar? Is that how you say his name? Great fight, right? I thought you just talk about the New England connection, and does this kid have a legit shot? Because people are starting to ride that bandwagon, man.
It's tough. He's in one of the toughest divisions in the UFC. So, I'm going to try to level with you at 145 pounds. It's going to take some time. I'm not saying that on any given Saturday night right now, he can't beat Alexander Volkanovski, who's the featherweight champion, but you have a long reigning champion in Max Holloway who just lost his title. And he presumably will rematch Volkanovski. And then there are other guys above Calvin Kattar that he's going to have to navigate before getting there. Do I think he is Boston's best hope for UFC Golden Glory? I do. And I say that with all due respect to Rob Font at bantamweight, who absolutely could make a run at 135 pounds. It's a similar problem for him. The division is so heavy. Cejudo just vacated the belt, so Rob Font, I think, is aided by that they're going to take 2 guys now in the top 4 and fight them for the vacant belt. But I just think those guys divisionally are going to have to win more fights to climb that ladder. But Kattar's boxing is as good as anybody in the sport. He's got a great jab, great finishing instincts, toughness, heart, a great head coach in Tyson Chartier, a great primary training partner in the aforementioned Rob Font. I mean, they have everything it takes, the infrastructure to be world champions, but you just have to be perfect. And he wasn't perfect against Jeremy Stevens, was able to get away with it and produce a huge highlight and result. Sorry for calling it a Boston bomb. It was in the moment. That was not my intention at all.
Come on, I know. That stuff bothers me so much. Like you're just in it, man. And I know people get sensitive about shit, dude. But like this is a fighting sport, man. Like daggers, bombs, whatever, man. Like that's what you're doing. And I appreciate you like trying to be sensitive about it, but I think the UFC is the one sport where, like, dude, people do shit outside of the ring and they don't get penalized for it. I know that's controversy right now, but like that's the UFC in a nutshell, man.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And I brought it up, right? I just, in the moment, right? It wasn't like any pre-thought alliteration. It just, I'm excited for the kid when he fights. Oftentimes I'm thinking Boston. Anyone who's been in our region has been inspired by Bill Belichick and what the Patriots have done. So when we sit down and do a fighter meeting, he invokes Belichick's name. You know, it's not fucking me, right? So it is what it is, but I'm excited for Kattar. But I do think that he now is in this main event elite class where his next fight really could be another main event. He has that main event experience in the UFC now. And if he can be perfect in his next fight, maybe the one after that's a title eliminator. And we're really talking about him headlining a title fight at TD Garden.
All right. I want to ask about the Garden in a bit. All right. I need help with this. I really do. I can't judge UFC fighting. I can't do it. I feel like I have it in boxing. I know you have to knock the champ out in order to win. So a couple of fights this week. Cowboy Cerrone, I thought, won the fight. And you're there every day, man. So tell me how he lost that fight. There was a couple of Cruz. I mean, there was a stoppage on that one. And the Anthony Smith thing, man, like I said, throw in the towel. I don't know if they had his best interest. He backed his team. You had a nice post today about it, but can you just help on how to score, man, in UFC?
One of Anthony Smith's coaches just texted me while we're on the air, so that's why I got sidetracked there for a moment. So there's a lot to unpack there as you laid it out. So MMA judging is tricky. John McCarthy is the foremost authority on this, refereed for years and is now a commentator for another promotion. So he believes, right? So don't accredit these words to me. He believes there are only 8 or 10 really qualified judges in the world, right? And it's unfortunate that there are a lot of scorecards out there that are coming in from people that he doesn't believe are qualified. So MMA judging is an issue in our sport. There's a lot of our rules that is open to interpretation as well. So scoring is inexact. It was based on a 10-point must system in boxing that is not only antiquated, but doesn't really work for our sport. From a play-by-play guy standpoint, I got so much other shit going on, people talking to me hitting my talk back button, trying to do promos, that oftentimes when one of my broadcast partners is talking, I'm dealing with other things. So my scorecard, you might as well throw out. I thought the Pettis-Cerrone fight was close round by round. I probably would have leaned for Donald. I think what bothered a lot of us that night, even though the fight between Carla Esparza and Michelle Waterson was close, when there are 3 scorecards in the world that matter, and one of them's 30-27 for Esparza, and one of them's 30-27 for Waterson, you're really not looking for that. I didn't see 3 rounds for the Karate Hottie, but a lot of people thought she won that fight. So who the fuck knows? As far as MMA refereeing, it's not much easier than judging. I do think there are arguments to be made that the stoppage in the Cruz fight was a little bit premature. I can tell you, having lived this and my friendship with Dominic and my support of Keith Peterson, if you want to call it that, one thing Keith Peterson would have been looking for, no matter how much time's left in the round, is to try to intelligently defend yourself and bring a hand to your face. I know he was posting, trying to get up, but at that point in the round, I think Keith would argue Dom has to have the wherewithal to just try to intelligently defend his face, and that would have bought him the 2 seconds needed to extend that fight to the 3rd round. Do
you think that it, sorry to cut you, did that have anything to do with the Anthony Smith fight? Did that have anything to do with Smith? And dude, was it a punch in the face? Because you at the time you were like, was that a eye poke? I don't think you guys really knew what happened. He was daggered, man. He started taking a shot, and then I don't know how he hung in there, dude. I give him balls, right? Balls. I'll respect that guy forever. But the fact that he's sitting there and he's saying, dude, my teeth are coming out, and the corner is like, no, we don't end things like this. I know you're getting text messages, but like, what were you thinking, man, during this?
Well, it's hard for me in the position I'm in to levy a charge at Jason Herzog, the referee, who happens to be a friend of mine. I think my thesis statement from the whole week is that I got to stop making friends with fighters and referees, and it's easier said than done. I mean, Dominic Cruz is one of my best friends in the world, and I didn't put that friendship in jeopardy by defending Keith the way I did. But I felt like somebody needed to step up for the referees that don't have the platform on which to do so. Does one have to do with the other? You know, I'm not going to levy the charge and say that Jason Herzog extended that fight because there was what many people believe to be a quick trigger by another referee at a high-profile fight 3 nights prior. But it's hard for me to just dismiss it, my man. You know, you're certainly not wrong or insensitive to bring it up. But as far as the Anthony Smith fight is concerned, that was a punch. And we do, generally speaking, as broadcasters and fans, if I can speak for us as a body, we want to see corners stop fights more. Technically, you're not allowed to throw in the towel. Take the towel and fucking throw it into the octagon and they'll stop the fight. Okay. So yes, we would like to see corners stop fights more. And especially in this instance, I thought there were multiple opportunities in which to do so. But I know these people are going to tell me that their athlete wants to be able to sort of die on a shield, so to speak. But, you know, these are the instances in which boxers die, right? Perpetual head trauma, and they keep getting up for more. So I saw too much. I'm not going to use the word disgusting, but it was borderline.
Yeah, and I don't know if you want to share your text message, but was this?
I'll check it. I'll check it.
And I only ask because, you know, do people come at you for the shit you say? Like after fights, hey man, I don't like what you said about me. Are you like, do I apologize? Do you defend your take? Like, how does that ever happen with UFC?
So
these fighters
So he just wants to talk about it, you know. So yeah, I mean, there have certainly been fighters that have reached out to me over the years that are upset with something that I've done on the air, and you do the best to navigate those situations. Oftentimes, I apologize, right? Like my wife never apologizes in life. I apologize all the goddamn time and move on, you know? Yeah. So I have no problem apologizing to the fighters, even though 90% of the time I stand by the call. You know, I will tell you the worst thing that's happened is I attributed a child to Corey Anderson when he didn't have any kids on the air. So he came after a win, gets back and has all these text messages, people being like, is there a child out of wedlock that I don't know about, Corey? So there have been times we've gotten our foot in our mouth and you regret that. But, you know, the athletes are pretty understanding. And as I've sort of alluded to, I'm not here to make friends. I do have a job to be critical, not as much as the analysts, but there are times where I have a hot microphone and I feel like I need to say something. And there are times where maybe I step out of my lane and deal with the consequences thereafter. But 99.9% of the time, over almost a decade of doing this, I have stayed in my lane. And I think my boss would tell you that. So,
well, you've also lost bets, right? Diaz McGregor. I think did you have to get a tattoo after that one?
I wanted to get the tattoo. I mean, it's your verb if you want to say I had to. That's a long story, man. Like it's almost hard to do in less than a minute. And I always try to not be long-winded in these settings. But yeah, I used to pick pay-per-view fights on my podcast when I wasn't calling the big shows. And I did tattoo bets. This was not the first tattoo bet. It was the only one I quote unquote lost. But you don't put a tattoo on the line if it's not a tattoo you're willing to get or want to get. I would never like get a tattoo for losing a fucking fantasy football league, you know? But Nick Diaz was my favorite fighter, right? 209 is a calling card for the Diaz brothers, whom I love. We connect on different levels. They inspire me in different ways because of the way they carry themselves. And I'll leave it down at that. But so the tattoo is well thought out. I called Kenny Florian the day of. I talked to my wife about it. What wasn't well thought out was that it could have registered on Nate Diaz's radar during one of the biggest fight weeks in UFC history. So I regret that. And the fact that he thought there was any bad blood or me not giving him a chance. He was in Cabo, in theory, not preparing. And so I just felt like it was a huge ask for him to come beat Conor McGregor on 2 weeks' notice. Thought it was an opportunity to do a fun radio bit. You know, I'm a radio guy at my core. And it spiraled completely out of control. My boss obviously was not happy. Nate wasn't super happy. We have since cleared the air. But once he was upset, win or lose, I was getting the tattoo, and you can see I don't know if you can see it. There's the 209 tattoo. But once he was upset, Joey, I was getting the tattoo, win or lose. So it certainly made for a better story that he won the fight. And what was funny is I made the tattoo appointment on Sunday, right? I mean, I had every tattoo artist in the world reaching out to me. I had 100 guys just within South Florida who were willing to do it. So I had the appointment booked within hours of the fight. And literally Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, bro, I had the entirety of the MMA world coming at me like, where's the fucking tattoo? It's like I had an appointment Thursday the whole goddamn time. So was happy to be able to actually post that and then hop off social media for about a week.
I gotta tell you, that's so Boston, dude. that is so Boston.
I don't care, bro. Like, honestly, I really don't care, like, what people think. And the truth of the story is I wanted the tattoo. And if people don't want to believe that, I really don't care.
All right. So a couple other things. I know UFC ESPN this week. Walt Harris, Alistair Overeem. Harris, obviously his first fight since I believe it's the loss of his stepdaughter. And then Overeem's been around for years, man. Like, I don't have a feel for this fight. Obviously, you're in the trenches here. Is Overeem, I don't want to say over the hill, but he's an experienced guy going up a guy with a lot of feelings pent up after a traumatic just last probably couple of months for him.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll start with Alistair Overeem. He had the wherewithal to get to the U.S. before it would have been really hard to do so. So I remember seeing him early on masked on a plane, I think in March, if I'm not mistaken, got to the U.S. where he trains, knowing that this fight could conceivably happen. Alistair's got a lot of respect for Walt Harris. They were supposed to fight in a main event last December. And of course, Walt Harris's stepdaughter, Nia Blanchard, was murdered, and that fight did not happen. But it hit Overeem hard. He has 4 daughters himself, I believe. And I think Alistair, in some respects, came to the U.S. so he could try to make this fight happen for Walt. And I give him all the respect for doing so. He's not over the hill. I think, if anything, his fight IQ has improved exponentially over the years. He can still go 5 hard 5s. He knows how to navigate really powerful guys like Walt Harris. He was 4 seconds away from beating Jairzinho Rozenstruik back in December. And Jairzinho, of course, beat him, split his lip open, and fought Francis Ngannou next. So Overeem is not afraid of Ngannou. He's not afraid of Rozenstruik. He's not afraid of Walt Harris. And he doesn't deserve to be a plus 150 underdog. I think he's like plus 135 right now. So I'm not surprised that most people I talk to see value in Alistair Overeem. Walt Harris, I think, is the great variable here. There are a lot of different emotions. I mean, there's no doubt that Walt Harris is a plus athlete, and he kicks like a motherfucker too. So he can punch, not quite as hard as Francis Ngannou, but he punches really hard. He'll kick your head off and quickly. So Walt deserves the distinction as the favorite. And I actually think Walt could be aided by the fact that there's no crowd, because there would be so much emotion brought on by a crowd that would literally be giving him a standing ovation every step of the way. So I think for Walt, there are going to be a lot of emotions to begin with, and he's not afraid to let them show. But I think the fact that there are no fans, it stands to reason that could really help a guy who's dealing with every parent's ultimate nightmare.
A couple more for you, John. Claudia fights, I believe, Hill this week.
Yeah.
Your thoughts on that fight, and just, I guess, the woman fighters in general. The one thing I've liked is, Ronda had her run. She falls off. Like, Holmes has her run. Nunez. Like, I like that there's turnaround there. Do you like where, I guess, the woman fighting is at this point in UFC?
Well, it's incredible, right? You got to start the conversation with Amanda Nunes, who has so far distanced herself as the greatest of all time, that any other woman, Valentina Shevchenko included, are going to have a hard time. Valentina would almost have to win for the rest of her career without losing to supplant Amanda Nunes. Now, all that being said, Amanda Nunes is about to defend her 145-pound title for the first time. She's a natural bantamweight, which is 135. So she puts her legacy on the line really every time she steps in there in some respects. So if she were to not defend the belt against Felicia Spencer, maybe that would give Valentina an opening. But the 115-pound division, which you sort of referenced with Claudia Gadelha and Angela Hill fighting in the co-main event on Saturday night, this is the division, right? This is the deepest women's division. This is the top 5 with 4 former champions and a wrestler in Tatiana Suarez that might be the biggest problem for every one of the 4 former champions, right? Angela Hill is the Donald Cerrone of this division. She fought 4 times in 2019. And she's already gotten 2 in this year, which I don't think any other fighter can lay claim to. So she wants to be active. She's better when she's in this type of cycle. She is a a smart fighter who doesn't like to have a lot of time between fights to think about those fights and perseverate on her opponents. So quick turns are good for her. But Claudia Gadelha is the favorite for a reason. You know, she's the woman who competed in the first UFC strawweight fight ever, which was in 2014. She's a perennial, not just contender, but top contender type. She wrestles, she's disciplined, and she seems to be in a really good headspace. So, you know, I don't bet these fights. You know, I have a lot of intimate knowledge on these fights, but I do think Angela Hill probably deserves a little more respect from Vegas, but again, not so much respect that she'd be favored.
John, I always tell people to bet the underdogs in the especially in the prelims, though. Like, it didn't, not so much UFC 249, but in general, dude, you just throw $100 on all of them, dude. You'll win money in the end. So I'm glad that you bring up the aspect of gambling all the time when it comes to UFC.
Well, hey, I mean, when I was at Fox at one point, you know, because, you know, it's always been a calling card for me. They said, hey, we want you to, mention the odds for every fight from now on the main card. And I was like, sir, I can do that for you. I can get that done for you. And I don't do it every fight now, but almost every fight we try to get that out there for you. So, and I would say, too, a lot of people will tell you, be careful with women's MMA because you are leaving it in the judges' hands statistically more than in the men's game. A lot of those fights go the distance. So Esparza Waterson, you might have felt like you had a pretty good read on Waterson as the dog, and judges took it out of your hands.
All right, so one other thing. The laziest thing I think you can do when you talk to somebody in UFC is to talk about Conor McGregor. I know he's more than polarizing. He's like, everyone wants to know what's going on with Conor McGregor. For me, I want to know what's going on with Masvidal, Usman, Covington. Like, what's next for Conor McGregor? I appreciate those guys more than McGregor. McGregor's always in it for the payday. He's in for the boxing thing. And I know he's been good for the sport. Do you agree with that? Like, what is your overall thoughts on what Conor McGregor's done for UFC?
He's in it for mixed martial arts legacy, my man. Like, he really is. I mean, he's such an elite fighter and striker and master of distance management, which is the most important thing in striking, that he has the utmost respect of the truly elite guys. Like, you should hear Demetrius Johnson talk about Conor, and we just lose sight of it, right? Because of everything else that he brings to the table. He's never going to be a third lung guy like Colby Covington, who's super fresh in the 5th round of a title fight, right? I knew I had no win from the time I was playing soccer in Wellesley when I was 8 years old, you know? So I just think he is what he is as a fighter, and that is one of the best, most precise, thoughtful strikers in UFC history. Obviously, all the big fights are there for him, but that's because he did about as much with the Cerrone fight as he possibly could have. Certainly, I wanted to see him fight Justin Gaethje that night. It would have been a closer fight according to Vegas, but he chose to fight Donald, and he busted his nose with a shoulder that unlike any we had seen before in less than a minute. So I think there are a lot of big fights for Conor. Obviously, the fact that there's now an interim title in this division kind of mutes his championship hopes, at least right now, but there's a ton of big fights for him. Ferguson would have been a great fight, but now he needs to heal for an extended period of time. So, you know, we'll see. We'll see if they can get the Masvidal fight done. I know Masvidal and Usman for the undisputed welterweight title makes more sense to Dana and most everyone else. So, but if Conor wants to fight, I don't know. The crowd's an issue too. You're going to do a Conor fight without a crowd? I don't know.
Dude, he came here for the St. Patrick's Day parade a year ago in Boston. There was a Bruins game going on. And like, he literally took over. That's all anybody talked about in Boston that day. Forget that there was a Bruins game. Like, the Bruins were even enamored that he was there that day. Like, I think about this now, right? This Jordan documentary is going on, and in my opinion, like, the 3 biggest, stars of all time are Muhammad Ali, Babe Ruth, and Michael Jordan.
Right.
I put Tiger Woods in that category.
Yeah.
Would you put Conor McGregor in that category?
It's tricky, right? Because he hasn't had a chance to extend his mixed martial arts legacy the way I thought he would in terms of the volume of UFC fights, because he got the Mayweather fight and he became this global icon. So, you know, the short answer is yes, right? But I'd like to see him bolster his MMA legacy to really hold up in the group that you're describing. And it's weird to say that, but from a global icon standpoint, he absolutely is in that company. It's a fascinating question that I hadn't given a lot of thought, thus the dramatic pause. But I think that history will probably probably include him in that class. I mean, hey, we're still fighting for this sport as far as mainstream and domestically. So I'm honored that you asked the question, but we're still fighting to do huge numbers on ESPN.
That's right. Your boy Pep checks in. Sup, Anik.
I mean, listen to the top of the show, Pep. Fuck.
I know he's gave you pretty much loved you. Still does. All right, you were in boxing for years. Bob Arum, Dana White, like Dana White's come out and said the guy's ruined the sport. Did he? And is it just that there's not great fighters anymore? Do you still get into it? Do you still get the buzz for it? Fury Wilder, like I still can't believe they threw in the towel in that last match. But like, how do you feel about the sport of boxing when you covered it, you loved it, you were around it, and now you're in UFC?
When I was covering boxing early 2000s into the mid 2000s, it was the biggest story in sports 5 or 6 times a year, maybe 8 times a year. Even Bernard Hopkins versus Winky Wright, which was one of the smaller fights that we covered, candidly, felt big. Covered De La Hoya Mayweather, covered Mayweather Hatton. I mean, a ton of big fights over the years. I'm no longer a boxing authority to tell you whether or not Bob Arum has ruined the sport, man. To be brutally honest with you, I mean, I'm not ingesting a lot of it. Certainly the big fights I have ordered over the past few years. I mean, there's certain guys who will always get me to pull the trigger, like Canelo Alvarez, Tyson Fury is all the rage right now, and deservedly so. But yeah, only a couple times a year am I all in. I'm not following it on a day-to-day basis. And when I do watch it, right, even the prelim on the last Tyson Fury card, I feared for the guy's life, watched a huge underdog take a whole lot of unnecessary damage with a referee that didn't stop the fight. So it seems super dangerous to me, and that might sound awful coming from an MMA guy. Our sport's far more superficially violent than theirs, so I have a hard time watching it, and I don't know, man. I just want to see them go for takedowns every time I watch.
All right, John. I know your voice. You've been using that voice, man, all week long. They got you off for us. When can we hear you again? What next? What do you even know? The next fight you're going to be calling?
It's a great question, my man. So I think we might get one done for May 30th, maybe June 6th. But I can sit here and tell you right now, I have no date, no location, no fight card. So I'm hopeful that we get something done. It's certainly rare if we do have a card in 15 days that I got nothing in front of me. But you can be sure Dana White, once he gets these 3 in the can, God willing, he'll be back to work on Monday.
All right, I want you to plug the Anik Florian pub. But real quick, do you know where Fight Island is? Will anybody know where Fight Island is?
So if you had asked me 24 hours, I would have had far less clarity than I do now. But even now, I can't tell you that my information is good. I don't know where Fight Island is, but I'll probably be willing to go if they call my number.
Sure, it'll be a hell of a party. All right, man, plug it. Anik Florian, you guys have been going at it for years, man, and I'm sure you're going to spill a lot more information from what happened this week as well.
It's crazy that we fell kind of late to the podcast game, and we have just crossed our 5-year anniversary. But the Anik and Florian podcast, Kenny Florian, my broadcast partner, fought for a UFC belt 3 times, played college soccer at Boston College, grew up in Dover, Sherburne, went to DS and all that. So that's my guy right there. We're live every Monday, and if people like this UFC shit, might as well pop on over.
People love it, man. Dude, I appreciate it, man. It's great to catch up with you. Like I said, you're a guy who did it. You were in the business. You kept on plugging, man. People liked you, right? You got to be likable and available.
I mean, if you're looking for haters, I'm sure they'll populate below.
Oh, dude, Twitter is like, holy shit. Who would have thought? Like, people, I'm on Twitter and I'm tweeting, and everybody hates everything you've ever said. Like, they're just people who don't like your name or don't like your face. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, you're a fat guy. Like, let's just fuck with the guy because he's fat. But no, dude, John, seriously, man, you're doing a great job, man. It's you're repping Boston. Everyone's happy for you, and you're doing an incredible job, man. So I appreciate you taking a few minutes here on the show. I have betting odds tomorrow, by the way. I do a show in Boston on the Sports Hub tomorrow morning. Right. So I'm going to be giving out all the betting odds tomorrow on 98.5 The Sports Hub for all the people who have been asking here. But, John, appreciate it, my man. And like I said, best of luck to you and love to keep in touch.
Thank you, buddy. Pleasure to catch up. There's nothing you could ask me for that I wouldn't do for you, man. I'm happy to see your success and keep on that upward trajectory, my man.
And you got it. He's Jon Anik, the voice of the UFC, and also check out the Anik Florian pod. He is Jon Anik. Thank you very much, John. I'm getting out of here. My week is done. We've had a ton of UFC stuff. I'll say goodbye to everybody as well. Tomorrow, 7 a.m., 98.5 The Sports Hub. I'll be on with Dan Lifshatz, and we'll go over everything. Joe Murray just sitting here. Jon Anik was awesome. If you watched UFC this week, honest, great dude, local dude. Fuck, great stuff. I love that. I'm gonna share this thing, get it right up on Spotify and on YouTube and on iTunes. So wrapping up the week. Next week, we got Nick Gemelli on Monday. How about that? We'll talk with him on Monday, have some fun with him as well. I'm Joe Murray, just sitting here. Thanks to Jon Anik of the UFC. We'll talk to you guys next Monday.